I'd like to talk today about what I term strategic panic and its relationship to the 1862 Valley Campaign. Okay, the debate on whether operations of Confederate General Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson in the Shenandoah Valley caused President Lincoln to panic is one that has been recently enjoined in academic circles. The appropriate strategic response of political leaders to battlefield developments retains its importance, and this case offers insights into how to evaluate a strategic response. The origins of the assertion that Lincoln panicked are in the distant past of Civil War historiography. William Allen, who was a Civil War veteran, was a former member of Jackson's staff and the author of an early history of the campaign. In 1879, Allen described, quote, the panic produced, unquote, by Jackson's defeat of Banks at Winchester. In 1881, Confederate President Jefferson Davis described how Jackson caused, open quote, indescribable panic in the cities of the northern states, close quote. British author and Jackson biography Colonel G.F.R. Henderson wrote in 1898, open quote, in the cities of the North, the panic was indescribable. Even Northern authors contributed to the view that panic governed Northern councils. New York author William Tenney in 1866 wrote, open quote, panic. They wrote of the, open quote, panic Jackson's movements occasioned in the departments at Washington and the offices of the governors of the states, close quote. Union officer Alexander Webb in 1882 wrote that, open quote, the sudden intelligence of Banks' reverses and the fact that Jackson was on the Potomac caused the wildest excitement in Washington, close quote. Given the less than objective nature of most of these sources, some of them were by participants in the events themselves, it is not surprising that more recent authors have challenged the early consensus. Civil War scholar Gary Gallagher at the University of Virginia, in his 2003 collection of essays on the Valley Campaign, stated that, open quote, among the more durable misconceptions about Jackson's campaign is that Lincoln panicked in the wake of the battles of Front Royal and First Winchester, close quote. Gallagher counters that Lincoln, open quote, kept his head and used Jackson's success to coax McClellan into a more aggressive stance on the peninsula, close quote. An alternative interpretation is going to be offered here. An examination of what panic is and how it affects war would be seen to be in order. After reviewing the facts of Jackson's Valley Campaign, the President Lincoln's strategic options in response to that campaign, a critical evaluation of Lincoln's decision-making is possible. A review of the case leads to the conclusion that President Lincoln did in fact succumb to a form of panic, but neither in the way nor the time that post-war authors hold that he did. Defining panic, however, is a necessary preliminary. A traditional definition of panic is, open quote, a sudden overwhelming fear that produces hysterical or irrational behavior, close quote. Panic in northern cities or on the part of individual Northerners, however, does not mean that President Lincoln shared the emotion, although the political pressures generated by this panic might well have influenced his military calculations. Further, Abraham Lincoln's emotional state, even if it could be determined, is not as relevant as how it affected his decisions as commander-in-chief. For this reason, the paper will focus on strategic panic and its functional effect. Strategic panic, in this sense, means ceasing or diverting resources from operations that are strategically effective and commencing strategically ineffective operations because of unreasonable fear. The key issue is not the president's emotional state per se, but whether this was translated into his strategic decision-making. Were President Lincoln's decisions effective? Okay, to evaluate the effectiveness of the strategic choices President Lincoln made, three criteria present themselves. First, did the choice represent an efficient use of the military assets at hand? Second, was the chosen course likely to succeed given foreseeable difficulties? And finally, would the chosen course achieve the strategic goal in light of the accepted military thought of the day? An examination of the military thought of the day is necessary before examining the facts of the case. There were schools of military thought prevalent at the time, characterized by tension between the ideas of distribution and concentration. Distribution was the creation of various geographical military departments and the distribution of forces among them. Both the Union and Confederate governments created geographic military departments and distributed forces among them early in the war. The other idea was that of concentration. Napoleon had said in his maxims, open quote, "When you resolve to fight a battle, collect your whole force. Dispense with nothing. A single battalion sometimes decides the day," close quote. Napoleon's thoughts were considered relevant by Civil War officers. Jackson, for example, was known to have carried a copy of of Napoleon's maxims in his saddlebags. Baron Antoine Henri Jomini, who had written what was considered to be the standard text on strategy, had declared, "The fundamental principle of war is to operate with the greatest part of one's forces in a combined effort against the decisive point," close quote. Henry Halleck, nicknamed Old Brains because of this book, had read Jomini and translated his ideas. Indeed, in late May 1862, Halleck wrote to the president, open quote, Permit me to remark that we are operating upon too many points. Richmond and Corinth are now the great strategical points of the war, and our success at these points should be ensured at all hazards." The struggle between these two ideas played out in the Virginia campaigns in the spring of 1862. The main objective of Union forces in the Eastern Theater that spring was Richmond. Capturing Richmond would force the evacuation of the Confederate government, as well as seizing the considerable military-industrial resources of the city. Also, after the fall of New Orleans and Nashville, would be quite embarrassing. McClellan planned to land at Fortress Monroe and advance up the peninsula of Virginia. First, however, the railroads west of Washington had to be secured, and President Lincoln required that an adequate force be left in place to protect the capital. To this end, a Union force under General Nathaniel Banks had seized Winchester, Virginia in March of 1862 and pushed Jackson's small Confederate force deep into the Shenandoah Valley and away from the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Having thus secured Washington's rail lines of communication, McClellan deployed the main Union Army onto the peninsula in mid-March. On March 11th, however, the Lincoln administration relieved McClellan of his role as commander-in-chief of all Union armies and restricted his authority to the Department of the Potomac. Henceforward, the President and the Secretary of War in Washington would coordinate the operations of the various departments. The President, in the same war order, also created the Mountain Department in what is now West Virginia. John C. Fremont, the 1856 Republican candidate for president, was designated as the commander and ordered to open another offensive from western Virginia with Knoxville, Tennessee, as its ultimate objective. On April 4th, President Lincoln created two new departments: McClellan's old Department of the Potomac, the Department of the Shenandoah under Banks, and the Department of the Rappahannock under McDowell. These decisions would have far-reaching and unintended consequences that will become apparent hereafter. Having neutralized the Confederate threat in the Shenandoah Valley, some of Banks's force would secure the lower Shenandoah Valley, and the rest of his forces would move east and replace McDowell's 40,000-man I Corps, First Corps, which was then protecting Washington. McDowell would then take his corps overland from Fredericksburg to join McClellan northeast of Richmond. Thus reinforced, McClellan would then seize Richmond. Confederate leaders Joe Johnson, commanding the Army of Northern Virginia, and Robert E. Lee, advisor to President Davis, divined that this was the Union intention and were keen to prevent Union forces in the valley from going to aid McClellan in the peninsula. To prevent this, the Confederates had to act. Jackson took his force west to Highland County, Virginia, united it with a small force under General Allegheny Johnson, and struck a detachment of the Union forces of General Fremont at the village of McDowell. Then pushed this Union force back 30 miles. Jackson returned to the Shenandoah with his force and Johnson's, united with General Richard Ewell's division, and fell on a small Union detachment at Front Royal, killing and capturing 700 Federal soldiers and a considerable amount of supplies. From this position, Jackson could seriously threaten Banks's position at Strasburg, so Banks hurriedly fell back to Winchester and reported as much to Washington. This is the point at which the strategic panic occurred. The adopted course was not an effective use of military assets, nor was it likely to succeed, and it would not have achieved the strategic goal. The messages President Lincoln sent and received and the decisions he made provide insights into his thinking. At 11 p.m. on May 23, 1862, General Banks had informed Washington that Jackson had 15 to 20,000 troops, which is true, and that Banks's detachment at Front Royal had been attacked and the town taken, which is also true. Banks reported falling back from Strasburg to Winchester. By 1 p.m., Lincoln was aware of a report, erroneous as it turned out, from General Geary, east of the Blue Ridge, that Jackson, with 20,000 men, was advancing on Centerville, Virginia. Also worrisome to Confederate authorities was the disappearance of the Confederate force south of Fredericksburg. What military assets were available to deal with the situation? The Union had distributed forces among several departments and districts across Maryland and Virginia. The largest group was the roughly 100,000-man Army of the Potomac, which had the most important mission, the seizure of Richmond. McClellan was a few miles outside of Richmond, waiting for the final piece of his army to join him, McDowell's 40,000-man First Corps. McDowell was, by mid-May, south of the Rappahannock River, and on May 23rd, President Lincoln had visited McDowell and his troops in Fredericksburg. Certainly a topic of discussion was the role that the First Corps was to play in the campaign to take Richmond. McDowell planned to start his final move toward Richmond and McClellan on May 26th. Indeed, on May 26th, McDowell had pushed his reconnaissance forces to within 25 miles of McClellan's northernmost force at Hanover. McDowell's reconnaissance force reported to the Secretary of War the streams of the area were all, open quote, all easily crossed, close quote, and there was no sign of the Confederates. McDowell's advance toward McClellan seemed to be free of major obstacles. Remember, he was south of the river. The Rappahannock River was the biggest obstacle. He was already south of that. McClellan would later assert that had McDowell continued south to link up with the rest of the army as scheduled, open quote, we would have had Richmond within a week after the junction, close quote. There were four other groupings of federal forces within an operationally relevant distance. On May 24th, due to the Confederate seizure of Front Royal, Banks's 6,000-man Army of the Shenandoah was falling back on Winchester to protect its lines of communication. Fremont's Mountain Department had some 30,000 men, of which a mobile strike force of around 16,000 was in the vicinity of Franklin, West Virginia. Inside these substantial Washington fortifications were around 19,000 troops and 32 field guns and 643 siege cannons and 75 mortars. Now, remember, Jackson's force was around 18,000, 17,000. So the Washington defenses by themselves had more troops than Jackson did. Some of these troops were in regiments that were imperfectly organized, and some were even unarmed. There were other packets of Union troops, such as Geary's 2,200-man brigade along the Manassas Gap Railroad, Doubleday's small brigade at Fredericksburg, Miles's 5,000-man railroad brigade along the B&O Railroad, and a 10,000-man federal garrison in Maryland. So, what were the federal options at this point? An examination of the deployment of forces as President Lincoln knew them leads to one to see three feasible courses of action. One option was to order McDowell to continue towards Richmond and his scheduled link up with McClellan. Another was to order McDowell in whole or in part to move north to protect Washington. The third option was to suspend the move on Richmond and to concentrate on eliminating Jackson's bothersome force. In all these courses of action, Fremont's advance on Knoxville could be suspended and his inactive force ordered to operate against Jackson's exposed lines of communication. Ordering McDowell to move directly on Richmond promised great rewards, but also assumed great risks. Commonly accepted strategic thought of the day dictated that Richmond was the decisive point in the Eastern Theater. Both Union generals Halleck and McClellan thought so. Even Confederate General Joe Johnston believed this to be the case. With Jackson in the lower Shenandoah Valley, he was too far from the decisive point at Richmond to have any direct effect on any battle there. The Confederates, in allowing so many precious troops to go so far away from the decisive point, had taken an enormous risk, justified only by the extent that it would deny an even greater number of Union troops to the same fight. Jackson's force in the Winchester-Williamsport-Harpers Ferry Triangle was almost 200 miles from Richmond, while McDowell's force was within 35 miles of the Confederate capital. McDowell, moving forthwith on Richmond, would have turned that Confederate gamble decisively to the Union's benefit. The risk associated with this course was surrendering the initiative in the Valley area to Jackson, who had already shown the federal leadership that this was a dangerous thing to do. In the absence of any substantial reinforcement to Banks, it would be difficult to tell what Jackson would do next. Indeed, Jackson had been told to look to the feasibility of crossing the Potomac, and some of his men believed that they were going to do it. There was some concern on the part of President Lincoln that Jackson intended to cross the river. Between Banks's residue and Gary's small force, Wadsworth's Washington garrison, and the Maryland garrison, around 34,000 troops were available to prevent the fall of Washington. Jackson's seizure of any other feasible objective north of the Potomac would have been annoying but not vital. In any case, the likely federal seizure of Richmond would have been ample compensation for any damage Jackson could have caused in Maryland. The second option seemed to be the least effective and efficient. McDowell's 40,000 troops were more than enough to thwart any threat against Washington, but dividing McDowell's force by sending half to protect Washington and weaken the remainder to the point where the move on Richmond would be unacceptably risky. Consider, for example, if half of McDowell's force went to Washington and the rest moved south toward Richmond, moving 20,000 men through enemy territory in the face of a largely unlocated and erroneously estimated to be 15,000 men, plus whatever reinforcements might come up from Richmond, would be to invite defeat in detail. In addition, passively defending Washington would also leave the initiative in Jackson's hands. The third option had its own set of risks and benefits. Suspending McDowell's advance on Richmond and ordering to send a portion of his force west to deal with Jackson would seize the initiative from Jackson, maybe destroy his force, or force him to return to a position from which he could not threaten Washington and northern assets. This, however, was a negative goal, denying Jackson the initiative. It would do nothing in the near term to further the positive federal goal in the East that spring, seizing Richmond. In the end, President Lincoln chose the third option. At 5:30 p.m. on the 24th of May, before the Battle of Winchester, I might add, he ordered McDowell to suspend his movement toward Richmond and send 2 of his 4 divisions west to cut off Jackson in the Valley. McDowell acknowledged the receipt of the order and his compliance, and then he added, "This is a crushing blow to us." Later that day, McDowell wrote a second letter to President Lincoln suggesting he reconsider ordering Jackson's troops west toward Jackson, McDowell's troops west toward Jackson. This is what McDowell wrote. "Cooperating between General Fremont and myself to cut Jackson and Ewell there is not to be counted upon, even if it is not a practical impossibility. Next, that I am entirely beyond helping distance of General Banks, and no celerity or vigor will avail so far as he is concerned. Next, that by a glance at the map, it will be seen that the line of retreat of the enemy's forces up the valley is shorter than mine to go against him. It will take a week or 10 days for the force to get to the valley by the route which will give it food and forage, and by that time the enemy will have retired. I shall gain nothing for you there, and shall lose much for you here." Lincoln opted not to follow this advice, and on the morning of the 25th, the lead element of McDowell's corps, Shields' division, left Fredericksburg for the valley. At 4 p.m. on the 24th, Lincoln ordered Fremont to suspend his campaign against Knoxville and to move southeast to seize Harrisonburg along Jackson's line of supplies 70 miles behind Jackson's main force. Fremont, on his own authority, decided not to move as directed, but instead moved north to Moorfield and thence to attack Jackson's lines of communication at Strasburg. Thus, Lincoln's dual-layered attack against Jackson's exposed lines of communication, Fremont at Harrisonburg and Shields at Front Royal and Strasburg, became a pincher movement aimed at Strasburg and Front Royal only. Worse, because of the departmental command structure, Fremont, Shields, and Banks continued to operate independently, with Secretary Stanton in President Lincoln attempting to coordinate their activities from Washington. Jackson became aware of the trap and he was able to slip through due in large measure to the trifurcated Union command structure. Each Union commander knew for certain only his own dispositions, not those of the other commanders. This uncertainty, plus Jackson's heretofore aggressive nature, made the advance to Front Royal and Strasburg slow. Union advances were cautious and slow, and Jackson escaped. This tentative advance of three separate forces advancing towards an aggressive enemy in a central position was a foreseeable difficulty, yet this was a necessary result of Lincoln's adopted course of action. Lincoln retreated south all the way to Port Republic, where on June 8th and June 9th he used his central position and his opponent's lack of unity of command to deliver a check to Fremont at Cross Keys and Shields at Port Republic. At the latter fight, the Union forces had finally gotten to within sight of each other, yet even then they lacked a unified chain of command and were defeated in detail. Fremont withdrew to Harrisonburg and then Mount Jackson, and Shields to near Luray. As a postscript on the campaign, Jackson, on June 18th, slipped away from the valley and joined Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in time to take part in the 7 days fighting around Richmond. McDowell's force, however, never made it to join the Army of the Potomac for the grand battle McClellan thought was coming. Jackson's diversionary campaign had stripped McDowell's 40,000 men from McClellan for that string of battles, and yet Jackson had still been able to contribute his 15,000 Confederates. So, having examined the relevant facts of the campaign, what did the history say about the alleged panic on the part of the president? The enduring misconception that President Lincoln panicked goes back to the immediate aftermath of the war. Published in 1866, William Tenney's book established the myth of Lincoln's panic. Writing in the late 1800s, when emotions were still high and participants still lived, Davis, Allen, Webb, and Henderson all took up the chorus. It makes for interesting history, an interesting story, but probably poor history. They all wrote of the panic in Washington after Banks' defeat at Winchester on the 25th. In 1942, Douglas Southall Freeman's work, Lee's Lieutenants, echoed the panic theory. He wrote that the magnitude of panic in Washington has not been exaggerated by biographies of Jackson, but the duration of the panic and the extent to which it was reflected in the press have been overstated. Southerner Shelby Foote, writing more than a decade later, believed that Lincoln had reacted with firmness and resolve. Lincoln has something more in mind than the relief of pressure on Banks. He wanted to capture Jackson and bag and baggage. Poring over maps of Northern Virginia, he evolved a plan whereby he would block the rebel general's retreat and crush him with overwhelming numbers. Yet, Foote wrote that this reaction was, quote, exactly as Lee had hoped and intended, close quote. There were two errors in citing these works as evidence that Jackson panicked: errors of exaggeration and errors of time, or restated, who exactly panicked and when did they panic? Just because some citizens of Washington panicked does not mean that President Lincoln did, or did others in Washington panic. On May 25th, Stanton did indeed send a telegram to Northern governors stating, "The enemy is in great force, are marching on Washington. You will please organize and forward immediately all the militia and volunteer force in your state." A cursory look at the geography and time would indicate that any crisis at Washington would probably be resolved one way or the other before militia from Massachusetts or Ohio could intervene. So perhaps Stanton was giving in to his emotions. Still, no real harm seems to have done by calling out the militia. It might even have stirred Northern patriotism, which was perhaps flagging slightly due to a string of Northern successes that spring. It seemed like the war was winding down, the North was winning, etc. It seems likely that President Lincoln was aware of Stanton's call for the militia, even if he did not sign it. Messages that were signed over Lincoln's signature show a man who was in possession of his wits. There were, however, two exceptions. In one message sent on the evening of May 25th, Lincoln declared he would be utterly helpless if McClellan had been beyond recall when Jackson's attack had occurred. And I've already said there's 34,000 other troops in Maryland and Washington. The other example was Lincoln's one message to McClellan on the afternoon of the 25th, in which Lincoln told McClellan, open quote, "I think the movement is a general and concerted one, such as could not be if he was acting upon the purpose of a very desperate defense of Richmond. I think the time is near when you must either attack Richmond or give up the job and come to the defense of Washington." Gallagher writes that this shows a commander-in-chief trying to motivate a reluctant and hesitant subordinate. This seems unconvincing since McClellan neither attacked Richmond nor came back to the defense of Washington. Nor did Lincoln relieve McClellan for failing to do one or the other. It had taken the Army of the Potomac weeks to move to the peninsula, so McClellan could not have come back with any sizable force in a relevant time frame. Lincoln had to know this, so Lincoln must have wanted McClellan to attack Richmond immediately, as Gallagher states. Yet it seems unreasonable that the president would really expect McClellan to be more aggressive after removing 40,000 men from McClellan's control. This message reads like something from the pen of a frustrated president than someone who had, quote, manifested a sound grasp of Union and Confederate strategy and an understanding of his generals' personalities, close quote. Early histories in this episode also confuse the timing of the alleged panic as well. Robert Tanner, in his excellent History on the Shenandoah of the Valley Campaign, wrote that, quote, because Lincoln soon did fear that the Valley Army might endanger Washington, and because he unloaded that anxiety on McClellan, the traditional view of his crucial May 24th orders has been that they were motivated by this fear. There is no hard evidence to support this view. Thus, Tanner correctly distinguishes between Lincoln's orders on the afternoon of May 24th, after Jackson's seizure of Front Royal, and Lincoln's somewhat emotional messages to McClellan on the afternoon of the 25th, after Banks's defeat at Winchester and the retreat to the Potomac. The president may have been momentarily concerned for the fate of Washington on the 25th of May, but he did not overrule the decisions he had made on the 24th. It was on the 24th of May that Lincoln took the critical decisions to abort Fremont's Knoxville campaign and to suspend McDowell's moves toward the link-up with McClellan. So what can we say about the choices President Lincoln made on May 24th? President Lincoln's strategic decisions on May 24th do in fact represent strategic panic. They brought about an inefficient use of military assets at hand. The foreseeable difficulties meant that the adopted plan was not likely to succeed, and they would not achieve the strategic goal. An emotionally panicked commander-in-chief might have done nothing or ordered McDowell's force into the Washington defenses. Lincoln was not emotionally panicked on May 24th. He was doubtless tired of Jackson's distractions and wanted to eliminate them once and for all. Nevertheless, the president diverted McDowell's critical 40,000-man force from the decisive point in the theater, Richmond. It was an aggressive move, but the key point is this: it was an aggressive move in the wrong direction. Even if it had succeeded entirely, it would not have aided the seizure of Richmond. Further, there was abundant reasons for doubting that chasing Jackson would be successful. McDowell had articulated to the president on the evening of May 24th the reasons why this move would probably not be successful. First, there were the factors of time and space. McDowell had to cover 80 miles to reach Jackson's line of communications at Strasburg, and had told the president that getting there would take a week, which in fact it did. The Stonewall Brigade, which was Jackson's northernmost infantry unit, had 50 miles to march along a good road, the Valley Pike, and covered the ground in 36 hours. Second, McDowell correctly pointed out the faulty command relationships between the three Union forces. Each Union commander was reporting directly to Washington, and there was no overall Union commander in the field. This was an amateurish command arrangement on the part of the president. Additionally, the relative isolation of each commander did not make for sound military psychology. Each Union commander would be facing an aggressive Confederate commander possessing interior lines, one who had shown a penchant for using a central position to defeat his opponents in detail. This was not likely to produce aggressive Union commanders, and the success of Lincoln's plan depended on the aggressiveness of the commanders in the field. For these foreseeable difficulties, Lincoln's plan was a poor choice. The adopted course of action was an inefficient use of the assets. While two of McDowell's 4 divisions were heading west against Jackson, the other 2 were inactive. Perhaps Lincoln realized the inefficiency himself. Once the threat to Washington appeared to have passed, President Lincoln asked McDowell if he could resume his advance on Richmond. McDowell informed the president that he would need Shields and Ord's divisions in order to resume the advance, and McDowell issued orders recalling Shields to Fredericksburg, open quote, to resume our former operations, close quote. On the other hand, the president's plan did finally get the men of Fremont's Mountain Department into the fight. Lincoln had created Fremont's Mountain Department for 2 main reasons, both related to domestic party politics. He wished to liberate East Tennessee Unionists who were suffering at the hands of Confederate authorities. He also wanted to give Fremont a prominent field command to shore up Lincoln's Republican base, and Fremont's 16,000 men had been idle before May 24th. His men could have been quite useful in reinforcing either Banks's 4th or the Washington defenses. Using Fremont's men in either of these places would have helped avoid the panic that erupted after Jackson seized Front Royal. Ironically, Fremont's unfortunate and unusual display of initiative in moving to Moorefield instead of Harrisonburg marred the one sound decision Lincoln made on May 24th. If Lincoln had marched on Harrisonburg as Lincoln ordered him to, this alone would have been sufficient to recall Jackson to the southern upper Shenandoah Valley. Ordering Banks to avoid a general engagement in order to maintain a force in being in western Maryland would have been a threat to any advance by Jackson north into Maryland or east toward Washington. Consolidating the scattered Union detachments in northern Virginia and eastern Maryland inside the Washington defenses would have bolstered Wadsworth's command. Given the masses of heavy and field pieces in those defenses, this would have given Wadsworth's command more than a good chance to defeat any advance Jackson might have made against the federal capital. At any rate, the allegations of panic on the part of President Lincoln seem unfounded or at least unfair. Lincoln did not succumb to an emotional panic on the 25th after the capture of Winchester. He did, however, give in to strategic panic on May 24th when he diverted McDowell from the strategic decisive point in the Eastern Theater, Richmond. The adopted course of action was neither oriented toward a correct objective, Richmond, nor was it likely to succeed given the vicious command arrangements. Both accepted military thought of the day and the sound advice from Irvin McDowell argued for the correctness of continuing the offensive towards Richmond and difficulties to be encountered in chasing Jackson. Yet Lincoln persisted in the error and sent his most important force on a fool's errand in the valley, in effect snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. In the end, it took the Union Army almost 2 full years and enormous amounts of casualties to reoccupy the positions it held in May 24, 1862. This was a heavy price to pay for a strategic loss of nerve. By May 1862, President Lincoln had learned much about his role as Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Armed Forces, but as this episode shows, he had more yet to learn.